You probably already knew that, but welcome to the Artist Now lecture series. Welcome to the public lecture series, free and open to the public. So I always feel like introducing all our potentially new guests. Before I introduce Jessica Muenig-Ganger, who's going to introduce our visiting artists tonight, I want to highlight a few things. Coming up, you can always find the Artist Now schedule on the Tech School of the Arts website. And I think I'm going to start doing this, switching from the podium computer to the presenter's computer, to show you the flyer of what's coming up next. You usually see these around campus, especially around the art school. But next week is Chip Thomas. Chip Thomas he's actually my guest next week. Photographer, street artist, and doctor from the Navajo Reservation. I've now started putting the PDFs on all my class websites to get the word out, but then if we scroll down, we have Faith Levine. We'll then have a break between visiting artists, and we go to Lois Bellefeld, I believe I'm pronouncing it right. But at any rate, next week is Chip Thomas. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have a printmaker from Chicago, but I will let Jessica make that introduction to you. I usually don't highlight events coming up in the city because there's so much going on in Milwaukee in the arts, especially at the start of the fall. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you about two events happening on Friday because they have such good UWM connections. Friday is an exceptional art night to get out and see work being done in the community by artists. Mostly, I would really point you towards Innova. The Innova Gallery, the Kenilworth Space, and Eastside, and the Innova Gallery that exists on our campus, right across the way, the theater building, the second floor. You can find all that information online. But there's a great retrospective of Dennis Sargent, who's been a colleague of ours for many, many years, and he is retired now, living the life in California, but he's coming back, and he has this amazing exhibition of his work, which is really kind of phenomenal. He also included some highlights from some of the exceptional students that he really mentored. So Dennis is going to be back in town on Friday, so check out that opening if you can. That I believe is 5 to 7-ish. Then take a beeline straight to the Innova Gallery at Kenilworth, which is going to be a party, because whenever the Knoll Show opens, there are hundreds, if not 500, 600 people who check out the show, because the Knoll Grant happens every year, and it highlights 7 artists who win this award. Faith Levine, who's coming in 2 weeks, is a Knoll Award winner as well. And it showcased interesting contemporary art. Certainly, it's very arbitrary who wins this award, so it's all over from film to contemporary art to contemporary craft, but it's always a special occasion. It's really highlighting Milwaukee-based art. So 2 great events coming up on Friday. I also would be remiss if I didn't hark back to Southern Graphics. I think one of the reasons why our visiting artist is here is because printmaking has become so interdisciplinary and so vital and so pronounced, especially in Milwaukee. In spring break last year, there's usually tumbleweeds rolling through campus on spring break with very little activity. Not last spring break. There was 2,000 plus printmakers from all over the country and the world doing lectures, workshops, exhibitions all over this campus, the city, and MyEd. The 2 major coordinators of it was Jessica Muenig-Ganger at UWM and Rita Yoon at MyEd. Unbelievable amount of work, and we'd be remiss if we didn't show our absolute show of respect to Jessica for that. I know a lot of the students are here, and everyone was absolutely essential in making this happen. Everyone in the department got behind this incredible conference. It was, the folks here, Kim, Yeb, Josie, it was nonstop. We didn't break over the spring break. We went, 15 hours a day. And the good news is Southern Graphics happens every year. It's in California. I'm sure our visiting artist was very involved with Southern Graphics. We'll probably mention it. But we have another amazing conference coming up in the spring. It's ceramics this time. The National Ceramics Conference is coming to town. And I think it'd be better to have a ceramics professor or someone else really highlight and share that information. But these really become important events and showcase what epicenter we have here. So, I'm going to change the battery of this mic because it's going low, and turn it over to Jessica.
While he's firing that up, I just want to thank Nicholas for his support of printmaking, an accomplished printmaker himself, and thank you for the props.
Yeah, no problem. Always
I can do the intro.
I'll fire up the battery.
Sonic boom voice. Developed in an art program. Anyway, hello, Jessica Muniganger. It's my pleasure to make an introduction. Before doing so, I'd also like for you, after Nicholas Lambert's class tonight, you are all cordially invited to be a Downer by the Downer Theater on Downer Avenue for a reception, closing reception of an emerging artist printmaking show, free food. So just saying, we'd all love to see you there. You can see a lot of students here at UWM, their work will be art, that's in the show. Anyway, so I'm here to introduce a native of Delhi, India, where he studied printmaking and painting at the College of Art. Shaurya Kumar, graduated with his MFA from University of Tennessee, Knoxville in 2007. Since 2001, Kumar has been involved in numerous prestigious research projects like The Paintings of India, a series of 26 documentary films on the painting and tradition of India, Handmade in India, an encyclopedia on handicraft traditions of India, and digital restorations of the 6th century Buddhist mural paintings from the caves of Ajanta. Kumar's research is focused on creating works which appreciate and appropriate new media while highlighting the dangers of its longevity and the disconnect between the virtual and the real. His work is an investigation of art and technology and the rift that lies between. Ultimately, his work is a dialogue about sight, how we cite effects and affects, data, and therefore a society, a culture, a people, and ultimately a person. Kumar's work has been showcased in numerous national and international exhibitions across the U.S. and in countries including India, China, Poland, South Korea, Thailand, Belgium, Bulgaria, Italy, UK, Norway, France, Australia, and Finland, among many others. His works have been installed at venues including the Dr. Bao Jai Lad Museum, formerly Victoria and Albert Museum in Mumbai, UNM Art Museum Albuquerque, SCA Contemporary Albuquerque, Queens Museum, New York City, Seoul Museum of Art, Seoul, Lagreen Gallery, Mumbai, New Art Center, New York City, Los Angeles Center for Digital Arts, Los Angeles, Museum of Fine Arts, Georgia, Schneider Museum of Art, Oregon, Charleston Heights, Las Vegas, among many others. He currently lives and works in Chicago, Illinois, where he teaches in the Department of Print Media at the School of Art Institute of Chicago. I invited Shaurya to be here because of his research-based process. The print narrative form area explores print and time-based media, a close analysis of implementation of traditional and new media, and his repertoire of work exemplifies a smart and seductively beautiful integration of diverse media. So welcome, Shaurya, to UWM, and we are just so honored to have you here today.
Also, I've reminded students in the past that you shouldn't have laptops open. So please have laptops closed. It's distracting to the students behind.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. This is my second trip to Milwaukee, one being the conference, of course, which was, Milwaukee was so different than now. But it was a wonderful conference. The conference, so congratulations on that. But thank you so much for having me over. It's an absolute honor. As Jessica introduced you, I'm originally from New Delhi, India. That's where I was born. I lived for most of my life. I came to the US in 2004, so it's been about 9 years that I've been in this country, longer than I anticipated, but been an absolute pleasure. But that's, in a way, like that's basically what my work is all about. That's where it gets its influence from. It's about of who I am and sort of trying to investigate that, understand that, where I come from, what are those influences that directly inspire my work and things like that. And I was very fortunate to be born in the country at a time and place where I was. If you know even a little bit about the history of India, it's a very young country, but still in a very old country at the same time. There is a very famous saying about India when it says that anything that is true about India, the exact opposite is also true at the same time. And you see that almost on a daily basis. We got our independence from the British in 1947, so it's only been about 65 years from now. And when the British left after about 200 years of struggle of independence, there was a complete vacuum in the entire country, sort of, culturally speaking, historically speaking. The British basically ruled for about 300 years before we got our independence. And the moment they left, there was, in a manner of speaking, an identity crisis nationwide. There was a huge task that the first leaders of the free country had about defining what it means to be an Indian, what it meant to be suddenly free, and what they could do and what they could achieve, and what they wanted to achieve. And that's always been part of the society, that's always been part of the community, and even now, to an extent, where there is always this rift and this contradiction between absorbing the new qualities, sort of from the West, from abroad, but also trying to define and retain one's own property, one's own philosophy, aesthetic, and things like that. And that's always been the case. So for the first few decades, for about 4 decades or so after the independence, up till maybe about 1990, India always remained a very closed community, a very closed society. They did not want to open up their market to foreign companies, to sort of retain their own economy, to sort of become self-sustaining in a manner of speaking. And it happened during the time when I was still I was sort of in my teens. I was in my late teens, early 20s when the economy opened in 1990. And it sort of completely took over what we understood what India was to be. I distinctly remember having my first burger ever in my life, my first pizza. And it's not that old, something that you always take it for granted was something which was very unique at that particular time. And as the market changed, as the society changed, it started to completely get absorbed into everyday life. And that's something basically what we see the change that is happening worldwide, especially in a country which is developing and young in that aspect. But while this influenced every facet of the society, India moved forward to become one of the world's fastest growing economy. But this idea of absorbing something external, something from the outside, wasn't that unique that happened, with the British or after the British. In its 5,000 years of history, India has always absorbed and attracted people from abroad. The Alexander came in 326 BC. Nalanda University, which started around 3rd of the 4th century up to the 8th of the 9th century, was the first residential university in the world, well before Oxford was even formed, which attracted about 15,000 students and 10,000 faculty from all across the world, all the way from Greece and Rome, Korea, Japan, and things like that. Attracting Greek, Islamic rulers from the Middle East, Portuguese, Dutch, before the British came in. And when the British came in, you'll really see sort of the difference that happened in the society as a whole, culturally speaking, politically speaking, and things like that. And the introduction to something like an oil painting was introduced by the British. The tradition of etchings or intaglios or engravings was introduced by the British. And the school that I studied in the College of Art, where I sort of studied after the high school to get my BFA, is still very much based on the British atelier system. The entire Delhi as a city was designed by the British, which still is a living monument of the work done there. And much of my work initially was influenced by these technical traditions that were still translated by the British atelier systems, where this entire observation aspect of making work, where what you see, like the aspects of rendering, the aspects of volumes, tactility and things like that, was very much part of our education, studying in our art school. Surprisingly so, Indian art scene also was heavily influenced by the Bauhaus tradition. After the Second World War, when the Bauhaus school was completely disintegrated, a big population came to the US, but also a huge population actually went to India and they formed art schools, still based on the Bauhaus tradition. A very famous institute is the National Institute of Design, which was formed on the Bauhaus traditions. And much of my older work, while I was still studying as a painting major, was influenced by these traditions of color theories and aesthetics coming straight out of Europe. And these are some of the older examples that I'm going to show you. But all through the process, as I was talking about it in a very cultural sense, and a very sort of nationalistic sense, I was having the similar concerns about what it means to be an Indian artist growing up in a time when suddenly the society became very global, very open, very absorbing to the Western influences. This entire idea of struggle to define yourself, sort of us versus them aspect of it, became very important to me. So while I was making these paintings and while I was making these works, which did not necessarily say anything about my presence in a community like that. Like I could have been in any part of the world and make work very much like that, which was in fact based on the Bauhaus tradition or the Western tradition and aesthetics, was something that was concerning to me throughout. And this is, to give you a timeline about it, I think this is somewhere about my junior year in my BFA is when sort of this work was happening and I was thinking about all those things. So one of the ways that I started to investigate about what it means to be Indian, for example, is to go back and look at the tradition in itself, go back into the history and see what it meant to be when India was known almost as a golden sparrow, where it was very flourishing, it was very supportive to the arts, very much had its own aesthetic, which was very unique in its own kind. And so I'm showing you some examples of an 11th century mural painting that comes from Ladakh, which is just south of Tibet. And then a 17th century miniature painting comes from the foothills of the Himalayas, almost in that sense. To the local traditions of dance forms, the aspect of tactility became a very important part of that. But at the same time, while I was trying to investigate in a very historical sense, I didn't have to look past what was there on a daily basis, on an everyday life. And some of you might be familiar with this festival called Holi. It's a spring festival where basically what they do is they take the color and they put it on. It's a celebration, it's a harvest celebration. And this is basically what it is. You take these bright saturated colors and you basically color anybody that you come across on the street. You don't have to know them. It's very intrusive in that sense. The sense of space, the sense of definition of space is very different, when it comes to cases like that. India is also a tropical country, so the light is very intense. There is no actual rendering, there's no volume that comes with a complete gradation when you sort of render or shade, as they call it, in an object. The light is so strong that the contrast is extreme, the colors are extremely bright and saturated and vibrant. India is also a country of billions of people. As you know, it's the second largest population in the world, catching up to China pretty fast. And that's a very typical scene of Delhi, which is about 15 million people in 25 kilometer radius. And just to give you an estimate of that, it's about 15,000 people in half a square mile, if you understand the density of that. So I remember distinctly that when I used to go to school, there are times when I would travel like that with a portfolio in one hand and hanging off the bus in the other, with 10 people over you. By the time you get to school or get to work, you don't know whose sweat you have on your shirt. It's that intense. And it's important to understand why I'm saying that. It's because this sense of tactility is so important. This idea of being completely overwhelmed by sort of, in all the senses, in all the aspects of you living on a daily life, which became very much part of that. At the same time, while I'm still sort of thinking about these things, I came across these two books, which I'm sure most of you would have read, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then Metamorphosis. But what really resonated with me while I was thinking about all those things is this entire idea of both the protagonists in both the books sort of trying to survive, trying to make their life as they were living in a particular situation. So they had to take control of the context when the history itself, or when their presence in a particular moment in time and space wasn't in their control. This aspect of survival, this aspect of sudden and immediate change, self-sustenance becomes very important. And not just me, but the entire community is going through that altogether. And suddenly you will see that my work completely shifted altogether. That was the first time when I discovered printmaking. Although I was a painting major, I had to choose an elective of sorts, so I could only choose one particular media and print that I could work in. And I sort of completely got drawn into etching because of the same aspect of tactility, of erosion, of corrosion of a metal almost in that sense, and in the purity of etching, we were using zinc and nitrate, so this entire idea of it being very immediate, very continuous, very instant, and very corrosive became very much part of that. The works came just almost about from those books that I was talking about, from the Hitchhiker's Guide and also from the Metamorphosis. This idea of a character of sorts suspended in this environment which is very loud and very sort of intrusive and very hostile in a manner of speaking, but still the prints and the images were not sort of hopeless. It wasn't about completely being taken over, but the psychological state of one's finding their way out of this hostile environment. That sort of slowly became part of my work. And this is sort of right as I was graduating, trying to experiment with this idea of viscosity printing, in which you would print very high saturated, very high tactile prints, where I would leave the plate basically overnight, even in acid for a while, and completely corrode it out and use the strength of acid to talk about this idea of texture and tactility as part of that. After I graduated from my BFA, I got an opportunity of working on a project called the Paintings of India that Jessica had mentioned before. It was a project which was a series of 26 documentary films, half an hour each, covering the entire tradition of painting from prehistoric to contemporary. And I was the main researcher for this entire project. This project was so intense that it's been considered by the Guinness Book of World Record for it being the most elaborate project ever to be on this subject, and it is part of the Limca Book of Records, which is sort of the Indian version of Guinness Book. But I'll come back to this project a bit later. After I worked on that project for about 3 years, I got an opportunity to work on this project called The Handmade in India. And if you haven't seen it, I don't know if you have, if it's in your library, it's one of the best publications that have come out for a long time. It's the only publication which is it's so comprehensive that it covers every craft from every state of India. And we were a team of about 25 researchers, and our job was to basically travel to smallest of villages possible, identify master craftsmen, document the entire facet of their craft, so everything from raw materials to how they process raw materials, what are the tools they use, what are the products they make, and things like that. And I'll sort of show you what the book looks like. So 1 quarter is basically a spread of each book. So it starts with an introduction of the state. It lists all the crafts in that particular state, the costumes that they wear, the main festivals that they have, the history of people in that particular state or a particular village a little bit. And then it goes on to describe each state and divides it into clusters and meta-clusters, and each meta-cluster then into each craft, and then it describes each craft to that. So you can see that how they talk about what the raw materials are, where they get the raw materials, how they process it, how they make it, and where they sell it off and things like that. And the reason for this project, and it was funded by the Government of India, was because as in most parts of the world, the craft is dying out. This aspect of labor, this aspect of something which was skilled, knowledge that was passed on from one generation to the other is completely dying out because all the young people want to go out to the cities and actually get a job, a paying job, rather than working on the crafts. So this is sort of the last attempt for them to preserve this history in a manner of speaking. There is supposed to be, it hasn't come out yet, but there's supposed to be a second volume which lists the addresses of each craftsman that we actually visited and documented. So in case if you needed to actually purchase something, you can go straight to the craftsman rather than going to a showroom and actually paying mostly to the middleman and getting only a fraction to the craftsman. But both these projects, the paintings of India and the handmade in India, gave me an exposure which was basically to the roots of it, to be able to understand what it means to be an Indian. I remember Gandhi, if you know, I'm sure you know him, gave a quote about, true India lies in the villages, not in the cities. And I got to see that in a real sense. I am very much, as my teachers call, a city boy. I lived in Delhi all my life, but never exposed to the village life. But to be able to work on a project and actually get to know them was just absolutely incredible. And to give you an example, there was this one village that I visited. So it was basically a photographer who was documenting, and I was the researcher and the writer for the book. And we traveled about 8 hours on a 4x4, went to this small village of 8 mud huts. No electricity, no water. Like, think of it like camping out in a forest, but they lived like that. And it got late in the night, and the photographer started to use flash to document it. And they literally dropped down on the floor and started to pray, thinking it's lightning. They had never seen a camera in their life before. So I'm talking that remote and that basic. It sounds more glamorous than what it is, but it was very shocking to even us to discover people still exist like that. Mostly we were working with translators because we didn't speak the language or the dialect that the craftsman speaks. So this entire aspect of you trying to understand where you come from or what defines a community, a society, or a country as a whole, but still being such a distant relation between them. But then at the same time, as I said, is the exact opposite is true as well. For you to be able to understand them so remotely without even language being a common factor. And these things were so significant in one's understanding of what the culture is. And that became very critical to my being rather than my work. I wasn't making work for 3 years at all while I was working on these projects. But once I finished that project, I came to Tennessee, where you only touch somebody accidentally on a football game and the other person is completely done. The definition of space is so distinct. The smell in the air is almost completely absent. And I used to laugh at things because when I first visited, and then they are giving us orientation on campus and things like that, they showed us the art school, and then they showed us the library at a distance. And I don't know if it's true here, but at University of Tennessee, as a graduate student, you never have to walk into a library in your life. They will deliver the books to your office, they will pick it up from your office, they will make copies and deliver it to you in your office. So you virtually don't have to leave your studio or your office if you don't want to. And then this entire idea of complete separation from the physical was just something which was completely mind-blowing. Anyways, I'll come to that again. But as I came in, for the first semester, because everything was suddenly so different, I wanted to keep something consistent, something that I felt I had control on. So I kept working in the same idea, kept working in the same technique, in the same processes that I was very familiar with. That's something that I knew was comforting. In a manner of speaking, and in this case it became the processes and things like that. So some of these works that I made are basically sort of in the first semester of my grad school. And I'm sure you noticed that the way I was working with etchings was very different than a lot of other people. I never put a hard ground and use an intaglio needle. I was painting directly on the plate, doing a lot of dry brush and marbling, putting the plate through a process of etching, layer by layer. I would make a plate maybe in about half an hour and an hour, late in the night when nobody would see me, how non-environmental friendly I am. But by then I would spend a lot of time in proofing and edition. I wouldn't need edition really, but proofing, getting the colors right, and I was working with viscosity, which is slightly complicated to work with. I don't know if you guys do viscosity here. So my purpose was to be able to just make as much work as possible to be able to understand what it is that I'm still trying to achieve with. And as I said, for about 3 years, I hadn't actually made work because I was traveling all throughout for the projects and things like that. So my teacher used to describe it as me completely being sunken in the bed of the ocean and me throwing all the garbage and the crap out to go back and sink on the level again. So this is me basically just making a lot of work, just trying to understand and re-establish my rules and my sources and my inspiration about my work. But then while I was making all this work, my world was very different. For 3 years in grad school, I didn't have a phone, I didn't have a computer. My entire correspondence with my family and friends was all through instant messaging. I was suddenly now ordering things online, which I had never done in my life before. You know, as an artist, especially somebody who works in print, you're so used to the tactility. You know, you're obsessed with the paper. You love the smell of ink, kerosene in our cases. We used to clean it with benzene, you know. So this entire idea of complete tactility as an artist is so critical, so crucial to us. And suddenly I'm sort of sitting in this very vacuumous, you know, sort of virtual environment, and I'm used to computers, but never to be able to give away my tactility, give away the physicality that I was suddenly now exposed to in that sense. So I made this work, and then when I made it, I had no idea what I was doing, as you can understand what happens for the most part. And I made this work, and I still do. It's still very dishonorable for me to go to my professors back in India and not actually take work. And I still correspond via email and things like that. So every time I make something which I feel is worth sharing, I send it off to my brother, who takes it on his laptop to my teachers. They talk about it, then he writes an email back and tell me what they think. So I did that, and this is right after those etchings. And I made this and I sent it off to my brother. I said, so tell me, what do you think? And he emailed me back, and he said that there's something wrong with an image, send it to me again. It did come through. So I sent it to him again. Then at this time I sent it, you know, as a different file format, whatever I tried it again, sent it to him. I did that 6 times. Every time he said, there's something wrong with the attachment, try a different computer, save it in a different format, whatever that was. And I had no idea what he's looking at. So I called him up finally, and I asked him, so what's wrong? What do you mean it's not coming through? And he said there are these white little holes. The file is getting corrupted in the process of it being translated. And I said, but that's what I'm trying to do though. Like that's what I was trying to say. And he, as always, said it very correctly, is that having a white space doesn't mean a loss. You know, an empty space doesn't mean a loss of something. And that's when I started to figure out that that's sort of what I'm interested in, to be able to understand the translation of a source, of something physical and suddenly something becoming very virtual. And somebody, you know, sort of living half the world across, looking at something which I perceive as looking as what I'm sending. You know, everything from the size of the monitor, to the curve of the monitor, to the calibration of the monitor, to the printer, all those things really start to interfere with the experience of the work itself. And that sort of started to become part of my work, which basically got reflected to back my project and the Paintings of India project that I was talking about, those series of documentary films. One of the things that I was responsible for the films, was digital restorations of these 6th century Buddhist mural paintings from the cave of Ajanta. That's what the facade of Cave 17 looks like, and that was what it looks like after the restoration. So my job was basically to completely reconstruct these caves, 6th century caves, of what they would have looked like when they were actually painted. And this is sort of another, you know, of before and after. What I also did for the photographer was to convert his 27,000 slides of all these beautiful paintings from all across the country and digitize them. You know, we're very familiar with this digitizing aspect of it. And my responsibility was the same thing, scanning them up, cleaning them up, restoring them a little bit, and then saving them on CDs. And he was using sort of these 5-cent CDs. I told him that it's not going to work. He gave me 3 CDs to basically save 3 different versions of the same one, storing them in 3 different places. And this entire idea of us, again, losing the tactility, but also this entire idea of losing control over a media, which was very different, which was very unique. And I did not have much information and understanding when I was talking with the photographer. But that work that in orange that you see sort of resonated with my thought that was happening about 2 years, 3 years ago, and that sort of came together. And I started to do research on this entire idea of archival purposes, or this age of the media and the age itself of the media. And I came across these quotes. This is a very famous quote. It's called the Moore's Law, if you're familiar with it. He was the CEO of Intel. And he said that the life of technology is no longer than 18 months. Basically, the technology divides itself, and you see that iPhones come every 1 year, replacing the old technology with a new one. Or in 5 years, it would be difficult to see your own photographs that you take digitally. Or digital data lasts forever, or 5 years, whichever comes first. And it's very interesting to understand a little bit the background about, especially Jeff Rothenberg. Is anybody familiar with him at all? He's a very famous scientist out of California, and he was invited by the Australian government to help them bury a time capsule, but in a digital format. You guys know what a time capsule is, right? You take something buried in the earth for future civilizations to discover it. And the Australian government wanted to bury a digital capsule in a form of a CD. Now, if you understand, normal CDs have a shelf life of 5 to 7 years. They make a special CD, Kodak makes a special CD called the Gold CD, which is supposed to be archival, but the age is 50 years. So I don't know what archival really means in that sense. But anyway, so the entire idea was then to bury a CD for future civilizations or aliens or whoever was to discover that. They ran into very obvious problems, like if you bury a CD with format, what format you would put in. How would a software be able to read it? To read a software, you need an operating system. To read an operating system, you need a hardware. So what kind of a hardware would it be that would be universally accessible, or literally universally accessible? 150, 1,000 years from now, and things like that. And it became so complex that they actually abandoned the entire project. And Jeff wrote a beautiful article about it, and I have one if somebody wants to read it. So I took this information, I took this sort of basic research, and this is sort of my second semester in grad school. And if you guys are in school, you understand what it means to be in a school, that I did not make work at all, even a single visual, for about 8 or 10 weeks. I had no idea what to make work on. I was just so fascinated by the subject to begin with, but I just did not know how to translate it visually, in a sense. I took this information and I went to, because I was in a university, so I straight went to the IT department, to a professor in the computer sciences, and I asked them what it actually means by the age of the media, like what happens, why the corruption happens, why the data loss happens, how do you make sure that everything on the university server remains as it is, and things like that. And slowly I started to collaborate with a professor and a PhD student who was working on this idea of digital archiving and digital age and things like that. And we came across with this software, which is basically a binary editing software, which is pretty commonly available now. And here you sort of see one image, which is about 5 inches by 7 inches to 72 dpi, having information worth about 1,000 pages if you were to print them out. Like so much of data, so much of content that happens behind the facade of the image itself, behind the screen itself, but it's so vulnerable to these changes. And that's what happened to a Kandinsky. If that was New York by Franz Klein, that's what became of it. If this was Ansel Adams, this is what became of it. And this is basically changing the single bit, the atomic aspect of a digital format in the entire file structure, completely keeping it very random. But still, even after all this, I had no idea how to make it to work, how to translate it in a visual form. Until I came across this data from a newsletter by Roma that more than 11% of people have stopped going to the museums and they view the exhibitions online. And we're all very familiar with this idea, but to have completely stopped visiting the museum itself, where everything from the scale, the texture, the quality, you can't even really comprehend how much goes into experiencing a work of art. And the complete absence of that became about my work. So I started to collaborate, as I said, with the computer sciences department, and this was an exhibition that came out of. And I'll just flip through these very quickly so I don't have to sort of spend a lot of time on each one of them. But these works were, I created a random, not a random actually, I created an archive which was a collection of artworks that were personally very dear to me. Some things that I always considered as very important to me as an artist, some things that I had always appreciated, something that I had always really admired and learned from. And I put all of them in this archive, and I took put them in a software, and then randomly changed a single bit. So I kept the rules pretty straight. A single bit in the entire file structure, and showed the results as if they were the original works by the artists themselves. So if you were to come to an exhibition called the Masterworks, my name as an artist, or my identity as an artist, or me personally as an artist was completely absent from the entire exhibition. Where suddenly the work was becoming very objective, where you would question the work only if you were unaware. You would only question the work if you were aware of the work itself, or the artist itself. And I'm sure you are familiar with the Google project in which they are converting museum archives into digital collections, like scanning them almost microscopically and converting them into digital formats. This entire idea of who owns a piece of work, who owns the rights towards those things and like that became part of the work. So me removing myself from the entire exhibition and showing it very objectively, almost as a matter of fact, became very much part of the work. But while I was working on the Masterwork series, I was being very subjective about it. Like I was choosing the works in the collection that were very dear to me personally. They would still exist in museums, in collections, still reproduced in books like that. So your experience was still very skewed. But what happens when the works are completely destroyed, when they are no longer available to get experience from? And these are some of the photographs from the Baghdad Museum. If you're familiar, in 2003, in the Iraq War, the entire museum was looted. About 15,000 original objects were looted and destroyed. And these are some of the photographs after they were discovered being ransacked. And so what happens in cases like that, when the work itself is being targeted to alter the history of a culture, of a society, of a country itself? And that led me to the project which was called the Lost Museum, the fate of the world's greatest lost treasures. It's a collection of work which have been destroyed throughout the history globally. So it's not about a specific context. It's not about a specific war or a specific accident. But it's a survey, it's a global survey of works that have been destroyed throughout the history. For example, it includes a work that was destroyed in the Baghdad Museum, a frieze of this animal farm-like scene. And as I said, about 15,000 works were destroyed. About 35% have been discovered back in fragments. Mostly what they do is they slam it down, they hammer it, break them into smaller parts and ship them across the world, and then slowly reunite them, getting it away from customs and things like that. But they've been caught quite recently. Quite a few of them have been discovered. Some of them were stolen by the staff themselves, and they sort of brought it back. And University of Chicago, the Oriental Institute Museum is doing a massive campaign about trying to retrieve them and trying to document the works that were lost altogether. But in cases like the Kabul Museum in Afghanistan, where about 90% of the work was destroyed in the course of the last 10 years, about 190,000 works completely hammered down, like almost to the point of they becoming sand, so badly defaced altogether. Bamiyan Buddhas is a classic example which everybody is familiar with. But Beirut Museum, there were 33 shrines in Timbuktu that were destroyed last year alone. And huge, massive iconoclasm that happens across the world because of that. A West Pediment frieze from Parthenon. If you know the history of Parthenon, Parthenon itself as an entire monument went through a series of transitions. It was first a pagan temple to Athena, which became, after that, a Catholic church, where they broke down this huge sculpture made by Philus himself and converted it into a Catholic church. So it broke down the walls, erected some really beautiful stained glasses, but still completely destroying the monument. After that, it became a mausoleum, and then it became a church again. And then in 1627, it was actually used as a go-down for gunpowder when it was accidentally ignited by the Venetian fleet, completely destroying the West Pediment altogether. Steels from Eritrea. If you know history of Eritrea a little bit, it's always been a conflict with Ethiopia. They're almost like two brothers with absolute no resolution seeming to come in place. And in 2001, when the Ethiopian army was retreating back from Eritrea after winning a war, they came across these fields of 10,000-year-old steels, huge inscriptions, very important to the history and the culture of the country. And they completely bulldozed them, like ran tanks over them, destroying the entire field of very essential history to the country altogether, just because they could. Murals from Bamiyan. Everybody is very familiar with the Buddhas of the Bamiyan. There is huge documentation. Taliban did an excellent job, at least in one aspect of documenting the destruction of the sculptures themselves. There are photographs in which you could sort of see step by step about how these missiles were transfer processed using the marble dust and rabbit skin glue, so sort of imitating these Italian fresco processes, the wet on wet painting processes, but using these transfer processes where they now imitate in physicality, like they are very heavy and they are very high in texture, about these fragmented, cut down, sort of, scissored down wall pieces that are now suddenly displayed in a museum-like setting, in a gallery setting, where one has no relation to the other, where the objectivity of the work becomes part of it, where you experience it as an object when it was never meant to be there. So questioning the context in which these were displayed becomes very much part of that. And that's sort of what my work is becoming about. That's what it is at this time. Some of the recent works that you'll see, hopefully, that is being materially realized, is that I'm collaborating with the University of Chicago, with the Oriental Institute Museum, and recreating some of the objects that were destroyed originally in the Baghdad Museum as well. Because we just celebrated the 10th year anniversary of this looting in April of 2013. So that's still becoming part of the process and collaborating with that. So that's my work now. That's what I'm working on now. So I think that's it. So, any questions? Should I get the lights? Yeah.
Do you have a most personal art piece or lost art piece that is personal?
I do. I have quite a few. In fact, I just lost quite a few works last week because my apartment got flooded in Chicago. So that's very recent even in that sense. But it's, again, it's the same thing about the way I sort of try to approach my work, especially is, I started being very subjective about the work that I always felt very dear to, that I had actually never seen in my life, but I always looked at reproductions. While in India, like all those works were masterworks that I talked about. So even those, but versus especially I remember my first visit to the Met in New York, or to the Art Institute of Chicago. I was horrified to see the kind of work that they actually put and the way they put it. And they're very, very proud of that. And I'm very proud of that they have it and they take care of it. But you can literally see the hammer marks, which are there, they're destroying it from the context, where it's a huge panoramic view, and all you see is like 3 feet by 2 foot sort of, defragmented version of that. So I have a lot of work which I see, which sort of disheartens me completely. And being in Chicago and part of the museum, I've recently, I shouldn't say that maybe, but I recently came across quite a few people who own those things, and the way they even project and understand and display those works is just horrifying. Very disgraceful, very dishonorable, but so. Questions? Yeah.
So to get your ideas for images like this, do you actually put an image into this computer program and then it spits something out for you?
It does, and that's one thing that I always do, is that especially when I was working on the Lost Museum and the Masterworks project, I was trying to mimic the basic, sort of the behavior of the archive itself. So doing the change absolutely minimally. That's why I stressed upon just changing one bit at a time. So what the program does, and I have a background in computer sciences, so I could write it collaborate with the professor and the PhD student, in which we could randomize the entire change altogether. So changing only the absolute minimum that would ever go through. So none of the images that you would see are ever multiple changes. They're only one, minimum one. And just like the way I would work with etchings I was talking about, that I would make the plates very quickly but spend quite a bit of a time sort of trying with colors and printing and things like that. In the same way, I make multiple options of the same image, and then I, in a manner of speaking, curate the best ones out possible to finally output them and then display them. Because there are sometimes, there is one thing about computers is that it's automated, where it would do the same thing no matter what you are feeling, what your emotional state of being is. But the other thing is, it also has a very generalization aspect of it. There's quite a few images that come out which become very, very similar. And that's another aspect of working with a computer-based work, is that if everything is converted in zeros and ones, how do you differentiate between Picasso and a Rembrandt? So sort of that completely generalization becomes very much part of that as well. So,
I think you said you worked with the museum that you showed. Did you ever think about collaborating with the museum to kind of create a space that would reflect a little better notch?
I have.
Okay.
There's quite a bit of challenge with that. But the Lost Museum, for example, when I showed you, was just exhibited in February at Dr. Baudajila's museum in Bombay. So it was housed in the museum as part of the collection, but not from their collection. So it wasn't their collection and then sort of transported into that aspect of it, which is actually what I would hope to do. But it was part of the museum, and the way it was perceived by common public, let's say, was quite wonderful to see their response, where they would do the same thing. They would actually look at it a very objective manner and not question an artistic intent because of my absence, in a manner of speaking. Because it was exhibited as part of the collection from the Council of Lost Art of CDLAC, Council for Documentation of Lost Art and Cultural Heritage. So it was installed like a historic exhibit almost in that sense. So it was part of that, and it was very different to see it as part of a gallery versus part of a museum, just for that response.
How did you, as an art student, make the jump to getting this research project? I know as some students, when they're graduating with a BFA, would never see that on their horizon.
That's a very, I was very fortunate to come across those possibilities. I should say that maybe. I come from a sciences background, I come from a programming background, so I was very interested in documentation. As a programmer, you have to document it thoroughly so that somebody else would understand it. But this idea, because my own work was so much about questioning my own identity almost in that sense, about what it is, what does it mean to be an artist in a given context. And hence I went back and tried to investigate what it means to be coming from India almost. And it's not specific to me or it's specific to a country or a culture. I think everybody does that. You see history of American art, it changed completely after the Second World War, where there was a complete stream of artists coming from Europe. And then suddenly artists in the US had to define what it means to be an American artist. So everybody goes through that. And I went back to research to understand what it meant to be me in that sense. So my interest in research, I think, came from that. And then when they discovered that I'm good at research and I'm not bad at writing, so then they offered me the position to work on the research projects, which I did. But I think for me, being an artist, it became very important. And I think it's for anybody who works in a creative field, is to be able to identify the specific tangential points which, with that particular moment or that particular incident, which takes you in a tangent which you had not anticipated it. And when I was talking about this experience of library in Tennessee, for you not to be able to take a wrong turn and come into a section that you would never plan to and discover a book that you come across, and then you sort of become, it becomes part of your life. This accidental approach was always dear to me. So it doesn't happen all the time in terms of you being conscious of that, but in retrospect, it's important to identify the tangential points and seeing what led you to think about these particular directions, in particular contexts, in particular way. And I think I was very fortunate to be able to discover that. Like, that print that I was talking to you, my interaction with my brother with the white holes, was very much part of that. And then there was another project that I did that led me in a different direction. Then coming to Chicago, and basically school and museum are attached to each other. So whenever I have to go from one building to the other, I cut through the museum, which I'm not supposed to. But I always sort of go through it just to be able to gain something, like a new object that I would always miss when I'm walking through the same hallway. But that sense of chance is always critical. And going through the Indian Gallery, which is now sort of the main entrance of the Art Institute itself, was always so shocking to me, because I would always stand in a corner and observe people walking through the gallery. And while people have to come through the gallery because it's at the entrance, they literally just pass by without even stopping a second, because they don't understand the context of it at all. And for one to re-establish that context, or to find the context of it, and that's what slowly influences my work almost in that sense.
Do you think maybe the destruction or removal of an artifact from its original context, or the destroying of documentation, do you think it adds a value or a personal appreciation at the same time? Like, if it wasn't destroyed, if it remained in its original context, do you think you would have as great of an appreciation, or do you think you might want to move past it and move on to something else?
It's a very good question, and that's something that I conflict with myself quite a bit. Like, for example, the Art Institute of Chicago it's what they call as an encyclopedic museum, where it is not just contemporary, but it's a survey of all around the world, in that sense. And they are very important for educational purposes, because somebody who visits, and let's say who never visits China or Greece or India or anything like that, would ever get exposed to that. So I'm definitely not against the museum or their collection or anything like that. But then there are certain ways, there are certain sources, there are certain mediums in which it is possible and certain it isn't. So I'm not saying that the museums should return everything that, the way they came from, by no means at all. But there is a difference between iconoclasm and iconoclash, and there is a difference between education. And a lot of what happens is iconoclasm. Like what happened in the Baghdad Museum was some things that were targeted specifically for monetary purposes, but also for cultural purposes. You see Bamiyan Buddhas, you see the Kabul Museum. They were destroyed because of a difference in faith rather than anything else. It was a political and a religious reason to do that. You see those steels from Eritrea, they were destroyed purely for political reasons. So those are the things that I feel are, as a culture itself, somebody has to take responsibility towards that, which people don't. When it comes to my work was not about that, as you saw the progress of it. My work was never political, and it is not even about politics, but it's about the way we understand ourselves as people. You don't know where you're going to the time where you come from. So it's the lack of understanding of your own self, and then hence your understanding about your future is what bothers me, or which concerns me.
Well, I did have a question. When you're doing your research projects, or even the series before this new series, were you still
It does.
Or do you find, are there similarities with working in the digital realm too? And do you find it's a similar satisfaction?
I think it does, because I think what you're asking is the difference between making sometimes and the research that goes before even you realize a project. And I think for me, doing the research is as dear to making the work itself. Especially, for example, if you saw in the Lost Museum project, every work that was part of it has a text panel that goes with it. So there's a lot of writing and researching about every specific object that is being showed as well. And so in that case, in a manner of speaking, the image is only a byproduct, or sort of just a way to enter or to get inquisitive about the project in itself. So I think for me, the research is as much as a creative process as it's actually to make it. And I think that's something which is very attractive to me, just as my personality, as my interest in a creative field. Also because so much of the work that happens in my own mind takes a lot of chewing and digesting almost in that sense, and the research gives me an opportunity to do that, is to be able to understand the context and the reasoning of why I'm interested in that to begin with. Whether it's all about an image or a picture, or it's about what the image actually says or what I want it to say. So for me, in some cases, an image is only an entry point, sort of a doorway into a larger context. And I'm interested in that larger context as much as I'm interested in the image as well. So I don't see a difference between, I'm not saying that I am, but a difference between scholarly approach towards making work and actually physically making work itself. I think they both go hand in hand. They're not, at least for me in my own work, are not that separate.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between, yes, there's this aspect of loss and destruction, but also there's so much beauty in your work? If you could talk a little bit about the relationship between that.
Sure. And I think I'll come back, it will sort of echo the same thing again, is because, as I said, that when I'm working with the Lost Museum or the Masterworks, or even with in this case, I make multiple options of a singular image, let's say from the same source, and then I sort of, in a manner of speaking, curate it, in which I'm selecting the work that translates or communicates the idea the best. So, in a lot of cases, the curatorial aspect of it becomes very important, because there are some images which talk very much about the source image or about the original. In some cases, it's the complete lack of it. And I think there's a balance between the two which becomes critically important. Let's say in Amber Room, as I showed you the example of that one, because it's all lost. They have very less documentation of that. It becomes important to showcase that aspect of it. In the other cases, when, let's say, for example, I showed you an image of Guernica. Guernica is a very famous painting which still exists. So in that case, there is still a reminiscence of the original itself, where out of 20 images, you might identify Guernica and question everything else around you suddenly. So there are some there are some peak points, there are some hints that one has to leave in order to communicate the idea. It's a complete contrast between the objectivity and the subjectivity at the same time. And both of them are only attained by the aesthetic image. And if an image is not communicating, if it's not attractive enough, it doesn't pull you in, it will not communicate the idea. So, lack of beauty or beauty, I'm not sure, but I try to choose the images or work with the images which I feel would translate the idea the most. But an entire spectrum of that in a particular body of work.
I have a question. So much of your work is so multidisciplinary, and to really understand, you're addressing through your presentation, your work, a critique of the archive, a critique of the diaspora, a critique of museums. Does this, are you writing about your work for your viewers as well? Is the format just exhibitions, but is the statements included? Because I can see your work working so well in book formats, and I'm curious curious how that influences your teaching. So I'm fascinated how you teach printmaking with this research component. Does that transfer to your students, or is the focus on the object? Because your work is so beyond just the object.
That's a very difficult question. I would hope that would translate to the students somehow, but it sometimes doesn't. But I think it's just I was talking to Jessica about it. It's that one has to identify their own interests and their own points of tangents or their own inspirations. One doesn't have to look outward. One has to look inward to understand what you're interested in to begin with. And that's basically, so it varies so much from person to person. You cannot generalize that in that sense. And at least now, being part of an art school, our studio classes are once a day, 9 to 4, so we have a longer day instead of like 3-hour, slots. That gives us a lot of opportunity. So usually my class would start with an hour of just open-ended talks, where I would just present something, whether it's a particular image or a quote or a statement or a body of work or anything like that, and then we'll talk about it, or they will talk about it, and then we go separate ways in actually making. And again, it's when I was moving to Chicago, when I was interviewing in that aspect, there are 3 philosophies that the school follows, and one of them is we are explorers, and making and thinking is actually not that separate. And it echoed with my work instantly. And that's sort of basically what sparked the conversation or the entire thing was, is that really one doesn't have to separate making and thinking, because you don't stop thinking. You might sometimes think in retrospect, after you have made it, and suddenly realize what you just did. I remember about 8 or 10 years ago, while I was still in Delhi, there was an article in the New York Times about if you want to hide something, don't pick up a paintbrush. And it was all about how you subconsciously translate what you don't even know about yourself about in a picture form. And not that we understand it like a psychiatrist in that sense, but it's an investigation of oneself. When you make work, you discover yourself. You don't discover somebody else. And I think that's basically what I translate to my students, is that you discover your own interests, you discover your inspirations, you discover turbulences in your life, or in a general social communal aspect of it. What is it that sparks? And that's basically it. And if when I was working on the Paintings of India project, when I was working on the Handmade in India project, you meet these craftsmen, you meet these traditional artisans who are so heavily invested in one little thing that they do. Like if they are just carving one thing, they would be doing that so beautifully that they would understand the complete aspect of it. Everything from making the tool to where it comes from, like in full totality almost in that sense. So being present in the moment is what basically it comes down to. If you are aware of what is happening within you and around you. And I think that's basically what my work is about in that sense. That's why it influences a lot by a quote that I read, or the news that I would read, or if I move from one place to the other, or something like that. It's not about the moment, but it gets exaggerated because of that. Or I discover something new about it, and it slowly starts to get absorbed and hence take me in an action. So I'm very egoistic and that's no, I don't think so, but it's about me trying to be present in a particular moment or understanding the results of that moment, I suppose.
Do you feel that the way that sort of globalization has been occurs today, with like the West sort of exporting our culture and economy and then I guess taking these artifacts and objects from their context almost for the purpose of commodification? Is this like sort of the only and final trajectory of it?
It isn't.
And I guess what do you see and sort of how as young artists, if we so choose, could we help to fight and reverse that?
I think it's a very complex question. And I think one of the reasons why you have talks like this is to be able to get exposed by different viewpoints more than anything else. What are the things that they are interested in, what are the things that inspire them. And it happens here in this country as much as it happens anywhere else, is to be able to establish one's own identity, about what it means to be who you are. And the reason why it's happening maybe a lot more in younger countries, and I mean younger, like India is a much older country, but in a younger country because it's recently independent and it was under a colonial rule for 300 years before it became independent. So because the change is very sudden and they sort of have to catch up with the rest of the world. So the trauma of that is a lot more intense than somebody else. Does that make sense? Like, I can tell you this, that I was telling Jessica about it, like my parents were furious at me when I wanted to come into arts. Like my mom did not feed me for 6 weeks, and I'm not joking. 7 years, undergraduate, grad school, 3 years of job. My parents still asked me to change my profession and go back into programming if I could, because all my friends are so rich, because they're all doctors and engineers and things like that. But so basically, it's to be able to understand the trauma that inspires you, if that makes any sense. If it's basically this entire idea of what it means, and art, especially visual art in that sense, has a lot of freedom and flexibility of being separate and isolated and having no repercussions on the society. But it does more than any other profession probably in that sense. And to be able to understand the larger context, significance of being an artist, the responsibility of an artist becomes quite critical as well. So, because a lot of people believe that they make work for themselves and that's it. It doesn't. Because you are translating it into a physical form for everybody else to experience as well. So the resonances changes, the associations changes. So there's some sense of a responsibility that comes with it. And being from, let's say, a developing country, it does that a lot. But you're talking about the export or sort of this economic colonization. If you're talking about that, classic example is China. I don't know, there was an article about 2 months ago about these replicas that they found in China. I don't know if anybody did that. Huh? The city itself, like there's a Manhattan outside Shanghai, exactly to the same scale, to the same grid. They have their own MoMA, they have their own Empire State Building, everything. So why to come to New York when you go to a better, cleaner, newer Manhattan in China? But they have an Eiffel Tower, exactly the same structure, just outside Shanghai. They had a Le Corbusier that they had to destroy recently because the Le Corbusier Foundation sued the government altogether. Huge. There's a cowboy town, I forget the name of it, in Austria, which is a complete replica of a town out of Texas. So, and again, the motives are very different, the intent is very different. But then that's where it comes down to, is the intent of it. What are you intending to say or speak about? So it's happening it's happening a lot. So I don't know where it will go. Any questions?